Cool. How's it going, guys? We're gonna start up. How's everyone's weekend? Did you enjoy the finally decent weather, intermittent between all the rain we've been having? A little bit. Sorry? No. I had one, maybe. We're going to be looking at CSS today. It's kind of like a intro to CSS lecture. It says CSS box model because it's something we're going to be focusing on. You guys are working on Tweeter, and part of that is front-end development. There's a greater focus than, say, the previous applications that you've been working on. And so we're going to jump into it. But CSS is probably something you've been kind of seeing on the sidelines, and it's been peeking in here and there. So you've probably got a little bit of exposure to it. But we're going to jump into not so much the design of CSS today, but some of the implementation things that are good to know about. We're going to look briefly at semantic HTML. We're, of course, going to touch on CSS, cascading style sheets. We're going to look at whatever reset and normalize is. We're going to look at the box model. And then we're going to compare block level elements versus inline elements. We're going to look at floats. And then we're going to kind of touch on what are the modern CSS tools. We're not going to look at using them, but in future lectures and activities, you're going to have a chance to go more in depth into those. But first, maybe just some like housekeeping, more broad bootcamp things. You're now in your, what is this, your 4th week. So, more new concepts. You guys have seen the pattern at this point. Bootcamp's going to be kind of fast-paced. Each week, you're building on new stuff. I'd say, especially from now on, the amount of content coming into you might be high. But this is more chance for you to explore and find material, because the course is going to be maybe a bit less direct in its guidance from now on. And that's not because it's like, oh, we don't want to provide as much guidance to you. It's to slowly start to build your skills at research, at looking at docs, at being a little more independent and explorative as a developer, because those are very important skills as a developer, apart from just knowing how to code, how to work with these different frameworks and things you're learning. Part of this means that if during lecture you see something, a new concept or syntax that you don't fully understand, a first approach might be to write it down and research it post-lecture. There's a lot of things that could be covered in lecture, and we might be hitting a lot of tangents if every new thing that comes up we have to go fully in depth into. So maybe first ask, is this a question that's very related to the topic that's being discussed, or is this kind of like a side topic that might be worth leaving to later to look at? Of course, this isn't trying to discourage any questions, but it's just trying to maybe focus our questions to be on topic. Just because the lectures, we're getting more in depth with stuff, so it's hard to hit everything, but let's focus on what is the purpose of maybe this lecture, and what are questions around that purpose. Yeah, but of course, I really encourage questions, and I think all of the lecturers were. You're going to be working with Tweeter. I think you guys have already started Tweeter a little bit. No? You haven't seen it? Okay, so this week you're going to be looking at Tweeter, which I guess is nice then, because we can... I'll make this bigger for you guys in a second. I'm just going to change directories. We'll look at a brief demo of kind of what Tweeter will look like for you guys. So we have... Yeah, man. You guys, I got some real nice Pokemon lectures coming up for you guys in the pipe. That one's not directly Pokemon related, but you see we have Pokédex and Pokemon sockets, two separate things. All right. Oh, I got error. First connect error. Oh, I reinstalled Mongo recently. I'll get it up and running for you guys after break. We'll have at like 11, so you'll still see it, but we're not going to look at it right now. But it's a Twitter clone. Following the name, you're going to be looking at working with sockets and things, but part of it is front end development, and you're going to be responsible for making the UI as opposed to being given some style sheets and HTML to work with. So we'll look at that after the break, but for now we'll continue on. CSS is there's a lot to it, so there's some things that we're going to be focusing on more today than other things. We're going to be looking at the box model and the history of CSS. And the history of CSS is important to this lecture in a sense because we're looking at some fundamentals of CSS, some ways of doing things maybe that aren't super prevalent nowadays. And the reason for that is we need a good understanding of how CSS has been developed and the practices that have been prevalent over time to kind of be exposed to these newer ways of using styling. So part of it is this box model. It has kind of many confusing parts to it. We're going to try and understand why those maybe confusing things are there. But for this week, it's something you're going to be looking heavily into. Later on, it's something you can move on to newer CSS stuff as opposed to it. Yeah, like we have to understand this older model before we look at the new stuff to be able to be a more holistic, rounded front-end developer. We're not going to be looking at frameworks. We're not going to be looking at Sass or SCSS. So if that's not familiar to you at this point, don't worry about it. And we're also not going to be focusing on HTML that much. So in our coding demos, if I'm skipping by the HTML parts, that's just because it's not the focus. But we do want to look at semantic HTML just briefly. So where? Oh, nope. Yeah. But not today. I think your day 4 lecture this week is going to be hitting responsive design and some SCSS. I'll double check for you because, of course, you guys are a little bit different than previous cohorts in your 12-week instead of 10. But yeah, I checked yesterday, and from what I remember, you should hit. But I'll let you know on that one as well. So first, our real thing we're looking at is semantic HTML. And this is the idea that an HTML tag should be expressive about what content it holds. It's tags whose names describe their purpose. The first example is that we can use a strong tag to give text bolded appearance, or we could use this B tag. They're both going to do the same thing. But semantic HTML are tags that give the reader, at a cursory glance of your HTML, an idea of what the tags are doing. If we just use B tags, if to someone not well versed in HTML, it's very hard to tell what this code is doing. So the example we can look at, if we look at my little basic HTML layout here, we've got a div, and then we've got another div that encases some text and a little emoji. To me, and maybe if I've looked at the CSS behind this, I've got an idea of the purpose of this layout. But maybe to you guys looking at it, it's kind of confusing as to what it's doing. It's just a bunch of divs stacked on each other, some contents in there. It's not very clear. The alternative way of writing the same syntax might be to use something like this. And so right away, we have these new tags: header, article, figure, and then footer. Whereas even if I've never seen HTML before, I can kind of look at it and guess as to what the purpose of this layout is. Well, the header, maybe it's a header. The article contains some information in article format. A figure is usually an image or document. And then we have a footer, which is the end of our page. So there's a big list of semantic HTML elements that you can look up. Let's look. So here's kind of example of the main ones: article, aside, details, big caption, figure, footer, header, main. Main's like, of course, one you've probably seen a lot. I would encourage you to come here, like just see the elements that you have available, and you can look up like a one-line summary of what they're supposed to do. The purpose of these semantic elements isn't to be like complicated. In fact, all of these semantic elements are going to behave the same way. They're going to behave exactly like a div. A div is like a division to block out different things within your HTML. These will behave the same way, but allow you to give more information on their purpose. They're not going to enforce you to use them correctly. I could put a header inside my main and like nothing's going to break. It's simply a way of being more descriptive in our HTML layouts. So yeah, if you find yourself making a traditional style website that lends itself to headers, footers, navigation, sections, things like that, keep this as a reference to pop back and see which ones you should be using if there's a tag that fits the case that you're using. The big thing, like one of the big takeaways from this lecture is going to be the tools that you can use to help in your front-end development. Because you're going to find, and front-end development can be this way a lot, that this is going to be like your process for working with CSS. CSS can be like very fidgety in that you like think, okay, if I just add this one thing to my style sheet, it should look like this in my browser. You'll make the change, and then you'll look at your browser, and just like a bunch of things have changed, and you're just going to be going back and forth, like wishing it worked well the first time. And part of that is you just have to get experience with CSS. Part of that is, some of CSS is not the easiest thing to implement. So these tools I'm going to show you are going to be your best way of kind of counteracting that troublesome CSS-ness. So the first one is within Chrome. Within most browsers, you have a suite of developer tools, but Chrome has kind of the most comprehensive tools, and that's the set of tools that I'm going to be recommending. With any web page, your pages that you're bringing up, someone else's pages is in this case, you can right-click and hit inspect. You can also go to your top right menu. Normally it's like 3 bars. Mine's a little exclamation mark because I need to update or something. You can drop down this menu, and there's like a more tools, and in there there'll be developer tools. I have never done that. I just right-click and go inspect. And it brings up this window for you. This window has a bunch of tabs at the top, giving you different beneficial things to look at when you're developing. We're going to focus on elements right now. I'm sure you've seen console for like doing error logs and console logs, but elements will give you both the HTML of your page and the styles or CSS that is being applied. So for any element in this page, I can look at the thing and what's being applied. This little arrow here, or little box with an arrow, is helpful. You click on it, and you can select anything within the document to highlight. So say I want to look at this title. I just hover over it, I left-click on it, and it will select that element within my elements console, and then it'll also select all the styles that are being applied to it. So this is all the CSS being applied to this element here. We'll look more at these tools throughout this lecture and see how they're used, but that's just a brief introduction. So CSS what is it? It's a little waterfall because CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. You can think of cascading as like you have this like multi-tiered waterfall, all of them pouring into like lower pools and collecting together until at the bottom maybe they feed into like a river. You have all these sources tiering together to form kind of one body of water. This CSS is named for this cascading algorithm that determines how to find the value or style to apply to an element for each thing in the document. And the reason it's cascading is because these styles can come from many locations. Just like these like tiered waterfalls, they're hitting different tiers and they're collecting together. They can come from different tiers to be applied to your document. So I have a little document here. It's just a basic, if you look at the HTML actually, I have one div, and then inside it I have just a bunch of nested divs, I think 4 in total, and each div just has some text inside of it. So div 1, div 2, div 3, div 4. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that for this document, we have a bunch of styles or CSS coming from different places. So at the top of my HTML document, just this for now, you see I have my head, and I'm including first just like a font family from Google, so some font. But then I have a style sheet. So that's the first thing we see is I'm including a style sheet called waterfall.css. I have waterfall.css open here, and it has a bunch of styles being applied to my page. I have a dot box, a bunch of styles that look here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because there's 4 divs. Within CSS, if I want to apply something to a class, I do dot and then the class name. So here I am saying apply all of this stuff to the class called box, dot box. If I wanted to apply something to like an HTML element, I don't need the dot. So if I wanted to apply this to all divs, I just go div. We'll look at the different ways of selecting stuff in a bit. For now, let's focus on, I have this one page. I'm applying slate blue to the text color, light blue to the background. And if we look at my page, I see this div, the outermost div, has slate blue and a light blue background color. But then these other ones have different colors. The inner one still has the same text color, but it's got a different background color. Third div's got different colored text, as well as like it looks to be bold and italicized, and then again another color background. So what I'm illustrating here is that CSS looks at all of these different sources that can be applied. So our sources are this CSS document. Then I have some style included right in the HTML document itself within style tags. I'm saying some class.inner, apply a color. So this is a text color of snow, giving it italic and a font weight of 700. And then finally, I have another style thing down here where I'm saying give the text a color of coral. And what we see here, the pattern we see here, is not that each element is taking its style from a single location, but it's cascading all of the different sources together to create one style to be applied to the element. So if we look at the outermost div, and we look in the developer console, I see that this outermost div has style being applied from a box thing and also from a div thing. But as I go inner or further in, I'm going to see more and more sources. So this second div has some style that it's getting from a .to thing, also from a .box CSS, and also from the div. So now there's 3 sources for this inner one. And then if I go to the third one, I see inner, 3, box. The next one, we have other sources too. We have inner, 4, box, and we also have an element style here. So the point is that although this inner box is getting style from the style sheet from the inline style or the style tags here, and then it also has another source from style here. It doesn't just choose one of them, it takes all of them together to form the style. So here, our last one, it's getting its color from something called element style. It's getting its font weight and its font style from something .inner. It's getting its background color from a .4, and it's getting its basic style of looking like a box from something called .box. Creating a new style somewhere doesn't override everything else. They get added together to form one coherent style. We'll look at how these are being selected in a bit. So .inner versus element style. But the point is we can add many style sheets from many locations, and they're going to get compiled together. So there's a few main ways that we're going to see styles being applied to our layouts. The first one is embedded styles. And this is what we saw in our example here. We saw in the header, I included 2 style tags. Within these HTML style tags, you can include any style for the document. So that's our first way that we can include stuff. And this is called embedded style. There's obviously some drawbacks to doing it this way. If we put a lot of style, it's going to take up a lot of space within our HTML layout. The next way that we can do a style is through external style sheets. So we include a link to the path where our CSS file is, and it'll apply all that style as if it were embedded within the HTML document. Yeah? Yeah, you can bring in, I mean, that's the whole point of like this cascading algorithm, is that you can bring in styles from all these different locations. So here, we only used one style sheet. I only linked to one style sheet, but I could, and actually should in most cases, include many. If I include everything in one style sheet, that document can get really big. Instead, I can break it apart for styles for different things in my page. So I might have a style sheet that just looks at my navigation bar. I might have a style sheet that just focuses on my content layout. I might have a style sheet that's just for a footer. And then to include them, I'm going to use like link. You tell it that's a style sheet with this rel tag. And then you give it the path. So maybe I have a menu CSS thing. And then maybe I have a like footer CSS thing. It will take the CSS from all these places and apply them to the elements that have been specified. Yeah, so we already kind of saw this a bit, but here our base color that we've set is this light blue. And that should be applied to everything. But instead, in this div, we see white color. In this one, we get coral color. So there's a way that CSS is going to be deciding or preferring certain styles over another. And if we're including multiple style sheets, it uses that way to decide which style gets preferred. But the important thing is it's not deciding which, it's not like a battle between groups. Like in my CSS here, this could be thought of as like a group of styles applied to a div. If I have in another CSS document or even embedded something like this, and it's a whole different set of CSS, it's not whether this gets chosen or whether this gets chosen, like the whole block of styles. It's done on a line by line or style by style basis. So it's whether this gets chosen, sorry, this one style gets chosen or this one style gets chosen. When CSS is building up all the sources, it's taking it and kind of doing this. It's saying, okay, let's apply all of the styles together from all of the sources. And then from there, we'll decide which style is more important than others. Yeah, so there's two algorithms that are, I mean, algorithms is maybe a scary word for them, but there's two ways that CSS is deciding what's being shown. And the first one is through this cascading algorithm, or this cascading decisions that it makes. It's taking all of the different sources and building them together. And then in terms of deciding what specific style gets shown, whether the color is blue, white, or this like coral color, it's using specificity. We're going to look at specificity in a second. But for now, specificity is just a way where these different styles battle and get to come out on top over another style. Yes. Again, we're going to look at some of these things. But for now, we're looking at the sources. So we can have a external style sheet, or we had an embedded style sheet. That's where you include directly within the HTML. You can have an external style sheet where you're linking this in the HTML, and then the actual, say, waterfall.css has information on the styles for the document. The last way that you can include a style is inline, which is a style that's going to be applied directly to a specific HTML tag or element. So our inline style in this like waterfall example is this coral thing. If we look at the HTML page and we go down to, I'll make it bigger for you guys. We look at this particular, this is an HTML element. Inside the element tag itself, I have a style attribute that I'm setting to this string here. And this string is specifying any kind of value pair styles that I want to do. I'm setting the color to coral. But if I change this, I want to set the color to green. I save. And then we refresh here. I now get the color showing up as green. And with our tools, I can see the difference somewhat in these styles. If I click on this bottom one, the inline style that's being applied to it is called here. It says element.style. Whereas all these other ones, they're coming from either an embedded or an external style sheet. And on the right, I can see actually where they're coming from. So this is telling me this style here, this .inner stuff, setting the font weight and font style, is coming from inside the actual HTML page itself. So it's an embedded style. It's saying cascade.html on line 8. Whereas this one here, its source is from waterfall.css. It's an external style sheet. It's coming from a .css file, not the HTML file. Same with these other ones, of course. Lastly, kind of down the line, we see this guy. And the source says something user agent style sheet. And this is, if we're looking through here, this is kind of like a mystery at this point, because I know about cascade.html. I made that HTML page. I know about waterfall.css. I made that CSS, and I am linked to it from my HTML page. User agent style sheet, I have no idea what that is. I didn't make that. It's telling the div to display block. That's not something I personally did. And what this is the browser default styling. So if I make an HTML page and I don't include any CSS, there's still some default styling that comes up. It's nothing strong. Let's think Chrome. User agent styles example. I wonder if we can see. So this right here is like the like user agent style. When I put like an H1 tag, it's bigger than an H2 tag. If I make a list, it's got these little like bullets in front of it. If I do the strong tags or the B tag, it's like bolder in color. Those like HTML basics are not coming from nowhere. They're still coming from CSS, but it's CSS that's been predefined by the browser. So if I don't add any style to any tag, a div, an H2, like a strong tag, any of these things, and it still has some sort of expression of itself, that's coming from, where were we looking at this? That's coming from our user agent style sheet. In general, user agent style sheets, they're subdued. They're the very basics that we kind of come to expect from HTML. If we have a link, it's that like blue text with the underline. But if you're seeing it within this developer tools, that's just where it's coming from. So we have these different ways of getting our styles: embedded, external, and then inline. You're going to be using, and most developers use external style sheets because it's more modular. It's a good way to separate your code and stay organized. But of course, you have these other options. And when you're looking at other people's code, if you can't find a style, look it up in developer tools, and you can see the location here. If it says element style, that's inline thing. If you see .html, you can look for it embedded within the document itself. And if you see, a CSS file, it's an external style sheet that's been linked. Embedded and external style sheets are applied in the order that they appear in the HTML document. So you should somewhat think about the order that you are including these files. Like Renee mentioned that we can include multiple ones. This style is going to be applied first, then this one, then this one. But when I say applied first, I don't mean like if I set a color for all of them, the last color to apply won't necessarily be the color that shows up. Rule of specificity, which we'll look at, we'll take care of that first. But if they're equally specific, if they are identical looking, then the order will matter. So just a brief look at syntax naming. You have a selector and then a list when you're applying style, and then you have a property and a value. So your selector or your selector list is the list of things you want the style being applied to. Your property is what style you're applying, and then your value is the value that you're giving to it. So let's look at our example. we had here, our selector list is we're just applying this to div, but then we have a bunch of properties and values that we're setting. Our property, we're saying the minimum height for this div has to be 200 pixels, and so on and so forth. One thing to look at is that our selector lists can be just that list. They don't have to be a singular thing. I can say I want to apply this to divs, maybe should to links with my A. Maybe I have some classes called 4. I had another one called 3. I can apply it to many things. We looked at those user style sheets, and something we have to think about with user style sheets is consistency between browsers. So I'm using Chrome. The user style sheet, this bit of style that's being applied, is specific to Chrome. When you use Mozilla or like Internet Explorer, they have their own user style sheets that get applied to the base level of HTML. Like historically, this was more of an issue because the different browsers had more aggressive user style sheets, meaning that they differed. They had larger differences between them than they do nowadays. Nowadays, the user style sheets are fairly similar, but there'll still be some minor differences. But especially back when they were more aggressive, a thing called resets grew out of the need to have symmetry between your different browsers. So if I apply some style and it looks nice on Chrome, then I open up another browser and it looks different, and I look up another one, that's like really frustrating as a developer. So people created these resets. And a reset is just a CSS style sheet that you can include in your project that removes any default browser styling. It removes any of these like user agent style sheets. The goal is to remove inconsistencies across all of your browsers. This is like the most, I guess, famous reset for CSS, and it's this right here. You can see it's trying to select every single HTML tag and just set everything to like a really base nothing. Margin 0, padding 0, border 0. Font size 100%, font inherent. Line height should just be 1. No line style, no quotes. Everything will just look bland and just like a normal paragraph. So what people would do is they include this reset into your project, and then it'll take away any uniqueness between your browsers. And then if you build your style on top of that, you'll have like guaranteed consistency across your browsers. Another similar tool to a reset, a more modern maybe take, is a normalize. So this is from the guys who developed normalize. Resets impose a homogeneous visual style by flattening the default styles for almost all elements. In contrast, normalize.css retains many useful default browser styles, meaning that you don't have to redeclare styles for all the common typographic elements. So what this means is if I used a reset, everything in my document would be like this word simple. I wouldn't have bolded and larger H1s or H2s. List wouldn't look like lists. And then I would have to redeclare all of that stuff on top of the reset. Whereas a normalize will keep some of the useful things of user agent style sheets, but just normalize them across the browsers. So normalize, the concept behind it is like, I think most people are going to want to have bolder and larger font for their H1s. I think most people are going to want to have a list. And all user style sheets do that, but normalize is going to make it so there's no inconsistencies between those base styles that is added. So, yeah.
So what do you recommend?
I would recommend using a normalize, because with reset, again, like if you want to use these tags that already have meaning, you then have to go and like code for every single tag that you're going to use. Yeah, exactly. So let's look at Normalize's page. Um, you can just download then that was a reset. So, I mean, it is up to you. Normalize is nice because again, you're not going to have to do as much work. If we're building projects with Node, we can use a Node module to use to get normalized.css. Of course, it's just a CSS file, so you can find it online, download it, and just include it the same way you would be including a normal CSS style sheet as well. It's kind of up to you. Yeah, any questions about like user agent style sheets or like the need, why you would have reset or normalize? Cool. I think you noticed in this lecture that we're not really going into detail on like the how to see CSS. Like I haven't really gone and said like, oh, this is like I briefly mentioned it because I just didn't want to like ignore it completely. But like I'm grabbing a class here, and then like I'm grabbing this. I'm trying to hit some of the bigger, more conceptual things because I know you in your readings you would have looked at the syntax of CSS. So that's not a huge focus, but I'll try and explain the new things that come up as we pass them. So within CSS, we have a box model. And I guess this is within CSS and HTML. Like they're obviously built in conjunction with each other. But the box model is the idea that every element within our HTML document has this model here, and which is called the box model. It has these different areas of the content that we can define and give size to. So the outermost area of the box model is called the margin. And the margin is what gives space between different elements in our document. So we can look at, I mean, we can even look at this page, we'll inspect. If we grab this header here, Developer Tools is going to highlight for us the different elements of the box model. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller so I can get that. So when I grab this header, I see these different colors popping up, and they're representing different spaces or sections of the box model. So this light orange represents the margin for this element, and the margin is what gives space between different HTML elements. So my this is like a H1, has this much space between this paragraph tag, because in my styles, I see that has a margin of 1.5. We're not going to worry about EM, but we could think of it as like 30 pixels, and it's got a margin above it of some number of pixels. It's like the box putting its hands out and saying like, don't come, like this is my personal space, don't come too close to me. The next area is a border. So the border is the line between the inside of your content or the inside of your element and the outside of your element. So the border is like from here onwards, this is all the H1. So we don't have a border showing up here because the border is like 0 pixels. It doesn't have a width. But if we, actually what would be a nice example? I have some style here. Let's go back to, I mean, we could do it on this page. One thing you can do with developer tools is you can add your own styles. So here we're going to add our own style. I'm going to say for everything, we want the border to have 5 pixels. We want the border style to be solid, and we want it to be red. Make it a bit small at 3. I hit enter. So we see this is kind of highlighting that everything within this page, every element that shows up is a box. Our header, that's showing the box of the box model. Our paragraph, our links inside here, any HTML tag has now got this 3-pixel red border around it. So then if we go back and we select our header guy, if I hover over border, I can see that the red border of the header gets highlighted. I look at the margin. The next stage inside the border is padding. This H3 doesn't have any padding. These buttons probably have padding. Yeah. So this button about this site has padding here. And padding is the space inside of your element. So margin is the space outside. It's the space separating this header from other elements. The padding is the space inside of your element to maybe give more room around your text. So this, about this site, it didn't want this word to be right up against that border edge. It wanted this nice white space around it. So it has a padding of some amount. And then the last number we're focused on is the last area we're focused on in the box model is your content. And that's where the things can exist within that element. So this is an A tag. Anything we put in this A tag has to exist within this blue box. It's the area where we can put stuff. This is a nice visualization of it as well. Get it nice and... Again, we see the outermost thing. This is our margin, followed by the border. The border marks the start of the actual element itself. Then we have the padding. The padding is a space between the border and content. And the content is where we can actually put things. These are all CSS properties that you can set in any CSS document, embedded, inline, anything like that. If I go to the right here, I can increase the width. If I increase the... I'm just going to link them all, meaning if I change one, left, right, and top will change. If I increase the padding, we see that green space increasing. If I increase the margin, that's like the hands that are pushing out against this box. And then if I increase the border, that's like this thick line around my element. The unique thing with the border is that you can give border color and style. So here we had, our border's red, but we could also say, I can give my borders a dotted style, and now the border has all of these dots around it. The important thing that we need to remember with the box model is there's 2 iterations of the box model. So we have both a content, so up here at the top we see content box and something called border box. We're going to do a little bit of an activity where, dang it, I'm just going to change my screen drawing so I can hide the size. Oh, annotate. Okay, so I want you guys, based on the sizes that we see in this box CSS, I want you to tell me what the entire width and height of this box will be. This part you can't see? I'll zoom in a second. So it says here for us, I'm just going to cover that up. I'll give these dimensions kind of like a more even number, so it's not too hard to. 300. Okay. So this is our style right now. We have a width. Let's just focus on what is the width of our border box. We won't do height. So when we have a width of 300 pixels, a margin of 10 pixels, a padding of 10 pixels, and a border width of 10 pixels, what is the total width of our box? I heard something. 360? And so you're saying we have 300 plus 10, 10, 10 on either side, so 360. If I remove this, we have a width of 340. And that's just because the width is calculated as the total, like remember we said the element starts with the border, the margin is like the space around it. So if I increase my margin, it doesn't have any bearing on the actual size of my content. So the actual width starts from the border inwards, but other than that, that's like the right idea. We have to do a double on either side. And this is how traditionally we would be calculating the sizes of boxes, but there's like kind of a big problem with this. And the problem would be, I have this one box here, and then say I want to do like a layout on my website where I have 2 columns. And I know that these 2 columns, both of them should be maybe like 5 or like 340 pixels in width. So I have my first kind of box with content in it for my column, and then I have a second box with it. But then I think, okay, in this second box, I want there to be a lot more padding. I don't want my content to be right up on the edge. This is like a big paragraph. Maybe this is like a block quote. So I want like only some, I want there to be like a big margin around it so I can have like big blocky like stuff in like here, as opposed to this content maybe having like a bunch of many lines of text. The problem I'm going to run up to here is now I have to do a bunch of calculations to make sure these are consistently sized. If this is 340 from my border to border, and I'm calculating that by adding my border, then my padding, and then my content size, if I change my content size in the margin, I now have to like recalculate. I've got a new padding number, I've got a new, maybe the border is the same, and then I've got a new content number. What do I need to make those numbers so that they sum up to be 340, so that both of these boxes are the same? So the big problem I have is if I want similar size boxes, but I'm changing the padding, I'm changing how the layout looks, I then have to do like, okay, you know, my padding minus my total desired size, and so on and so on. The other case where this can happen is I design a site, and then after the fact, I'm like, oh, I want to add more padding everywhere. My site looks really dense. I need to give more like padding so that the content looks nice. You see right here, if I add padding, then my whole site is just going to change completely, and I'm going to have to go and change a bunch of numbers. Yep. You can set max and min width, but your max width is just in this model, this content box model, is just going to be setting the width of content. So it just affects this. So if my max width is 500 and my min width is 500, this blue box will be 500, but then the padding, the border will still have a big impact on it. So luckily, like everyone who was developing CSS saw this problem, and like it's super annoying to have to like have all these different values for similarly sized things. So they, pushed really hard to get this new implementation of the box model, and this is called the border box. So border box changes how we size our elements, and it lets us do it with like one number. If I change my width here, it's going to change the entire width from border edge to border edge. So let's see. I've just set my width to 400 pixels, and we see that the generated dimensions are now 400 pixels. If I change my padding, I give a bunch of padding, my width is still 400 pixels. If I give less padding, my width is still 400 pixels. And just visually, we can see that it looks the same width regardless of if I'm changing my padding or my border. The content is then the content width, so from here over to here, is generated dynamically. I can't force this to be a certain size. My width, as my padding changes, it also changes. We see the blue box changing. But the important thing is that this size from here to here is going to remain constant. When it's going to stay 400 pixels. So this allows me to have that situation where I have this second box and I want it the same size but different padding and stuff. I don't have to do any thinking. I just set the width on both of these to be the same, and it'll act in the way I want it to. Of course, we have to specify that we want border box, and what my hint for you is that you're going to do it every single time. There's not a case when you're going to be using content box really. So one of the first things that you're going to be setting in your CSS, if it's not there already, is you're going to be setting the box sizing property to be border box, which is right here. So it's not the default, so you can use this star, which means everything. Apply this style to everything, and you say box sizing, border box. I want to be able to set the width to 200, and it actually behave like it's a 200 width thing. So just in summary, content box, to find the height and width of the element, we just look at the content size. Whereas with border box, to find the height and width of the element, we have to look at the content size plus the padding plus the border. So we want to use preference to border box. Any questions on content box versus border box? Yeah, we're gonna break. So yeah, we'll take a 15-minute break and come back, and I'll get that tweeter up for you guys so you can check it out. Mm. Yeah.
But, the rules are in like at the bottom of the waterfall. I'll change the style. You know,
No. So
okay, yeah.
if
That's the other thing. Quite confused right now because I tried bootstrap already get the top of the
yeah.
just cannot change it. Quite confused.
So the things lower on the waterfall will overwrite the things higher on the waterfall if they have the exact same selector list. So
Like
if in
what?
Bootstrap you have this,
Uh-huh.
and then in here I have this, and I set the color. I set the color to be red. It'll choose this one over this one because this was lower on the waterfall.
Lower in the waterfall.
But like Bootstrap, it isn't just doing stuff like this. It's being really specific in how it's choosing things. So it's saying .div.
They always have like class.
Yeah, they have like a lot of things they're selecting for. So because this is more specific than this, this will
More
be chosen
specific.
first.
Okay.
We're gonna look at specificity.
Because we haven't talked about this yet.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it yet.
Yeah, because this one confusing. I also ran.
Yeah.
Probably you can add important.
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
But he said probably in working a group project, it will make things more chaos.
Yeah, you have to use important like pretty sparsely because it's like the like Hail Mary kind of like big. If you put important on something, that's the only thing that can be applied. So if other people are trying to affect it, like it's gonna use that important.
Like, recommend that
Important? I would
at this level or just avoid it.
Some people say like only use like 3 importance in a whole project or something like that. So like try not to use it, but if you like are forced into using it, of course you can use it.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll try and cover it, and then afterwards if you have any questions, let me know.
Sure.
Okay, so just to start back off, I did get Tweeter running for you guys. This is the application that you're gonna be focusing on building over this week. If we scroll down, we can see a list of different tweets. I can compose a new one and hit tweet, and I actually don't know if I have. Yeah, you get the new tweet showing up here. There's this compose button up behind that drops and opens your compose tweet window, and you'll be building all of this, but particularly you're also going to be styling it. So this like menu at the top, these tweet kind of cards or highlight things. The styling of the buttons, the characters, everything is going to be in your court. Of course, it's going to be giving you direction on the style. Like this is the standard style of what they're looking at. You can customize things a little bit to get it looking how you want it, but this is yeah, kind of the end result that you'll be pushing for this week, which is really cool actually, because it's super usable and like I think it's a pretty awesome project in terms of looking and like functioning like something people would actually use. Okay. So next we're going to look at block versus inline. Every element within our HTML layouts by default are going to have one of these two properties. So block level elements, these are elements that start on a new line. They take up as much width as they can. And in general, they represent structural things. Like structural meaning they build up the layout of our HTML page. By default, block level elements will be like a div tag, an h1 all the way through h6 tags, paragraph tags, UL, which is like building up a list, and like navigation tags. A lot of the semantic tags that we looked at, I said they function similar to divs. They're exactly the same as divs. So they will be block level. Inline elements, they don't necessarily start on a new line. They don't affect the elements around it. You can't set a width, height, or anything because they're not structural elements. They don't take up space in the same way. They're more content-related stuff. So inline elements are spans, link tags, input tags, button tags, and image tags. So we're going to look at a quick demo. I have just a shell of an HTML page. The only thing I've included in the header is to get some nicer font than the base font. And I've also included a block.css style sheet. So within our body tags, I can create some like spans. And we said span, this is an inline element. So anything I do with a span will be an inline element. Whereas if I make a div will be a block element. So just to make this a little more visual, in my block CSS, I have, these things don't really matter. I'm just saying the font size will be big so you can read it. It's going to be bold so you can read it and have a nice blue color or like purple color. And the font family is going to be like this Roboto font. We could do the same demo without that. It would just be not as readable. But what I'm going to do is going to say our div elements, I want them to appear in a specific way. I want them to have a width of, I could do 400 pixels. I want them to have a height of 400 pixels. And I want them to have a background image. And in my folder structure, I have two images here. One's block, it's just this block, just so we can visualize these elements a bit more. So I'm going to say the background image should be that block.png, our block file. And then the last thing I think I'm going to do is I'm going to say background size, and we're going to say contain. All of this background size contain is saying my image could be really big, but I'm saying my width and height is going to be 400 pixels. Even though my image might be really big, make sure it fits within the 400 by 400 stuff that I'm doing. So this is the only style of importance that we've added. We're telling the div to have a height and width, and we're giving it a background image. I'm not specifying that should do anything else. I'm just giving it a background image. Back in our HTML page, we have one span. I've added no CSS to this, and one div. So if we save this and we open it within my browser, I see this is an inline element, and then I see a block, like a rock, which is our block element. And let's kind of experiment with how they interact with each other. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste another one. I'm going to put a couple inline elements next to each other. And then maybe I will put a couple block elements next to each other here. So if we refresh, we see how we can see it clear with our inspect. You see all of our inline elements, they are stacking together. So our first inline element is here, our second one, our third one. We said that they're not going to start on a new line, so they're not. One inline element here ends, and then the next one starts right after it. And then our block elements, we see, here's our first two. When they start, they take up as much width as they can, and they always start on a new line, and anything that follows them will appear on a new line as well. So they take up a block of your HTML real estate. Our block element here, our block element here, and then we have, one or actually two inline elements following it, and then we have another block guy down here. The other thing that we saw about inline elements is that they don't take up space on the HTML document. So I click on this guy, and I say, okay, I want to give you new style. I want to give you a height of, let's make you take up a bunch, 500 pixels. If I hit enter, nothing happens to this inline element, because inline elements don't have height and width that they take up. They just take up the space that the text does within the document. I can't specify this needs to be bigger or smaller or anything like that. I can only do that with block elements. If I look at this block element and I click here and I give it a width, height will be easier to visualize, of 600 instead of 400. And I hit enter. Well, it's taking up more space, but the image is now repeating. I mean, we could stop the image from repeating, but I can tell it to be bigger, I can tell it to be smaller. Whereas inline elements, I cannot. The other properties that we saw, it doesn't affect the elements around it. This is true in some senses of the word. Because if we look at this, we can say, well, it does affect stuff, because it's pushing this text over here, it's pushing these rocks down here. But if we look at the content or the element itself in what bounds that this inline element is taking up, we'll see something interesting. So I hover over this first one, and it's going from this top left corner down to this bottom right corner. But if I look at this second one, it's taking up the same space that this first one took up, but also a second line. And then the last one as well is taking up 2 lines. So normally our content boxes, they're not allowed to overlap or exist within each other. Inline elements are different than that. They will kind of merge together and flow to fill up a paragraph. And even though their content boxes are not being respected. So normally this guy's content box would be distinct from this guy's content box, but they're just overlapping, and they don't really kind of enforce themselves as strong elements within the page, whereas our block stuff takes up space and doesn't let anything else within that space. The next thing to think about, I'm going to refresh so this guy goes back down to 400. The next thing to think about is that our HTML layouts are a hierarchy by nature. We have elements within elements and so on and so forth. So there's the situation where we could have span elements inside, or sorry, inline elements inside block elements, or block elements inside inline elements. And then we have two ideals kind of competing with one another. An inline element just wants to take up as little space as it can and flow nicely with other inline elements, whereas a block element wants to take up as much space as it can, starts on a new line, all of these things. But the rule that we're going to see is that we don't want to put block elements inside of inline elements. And even if we think about this on like a logical level, it kind of makes sense, because how can a block element exist inside an inline element? An inline element can't have a height and width. It doesn't want to take up space. Whereas a block element is saying, like, I want to start on a new line. So those two things contrast heavily. And actually, if you do them within browsers, it's like sometimes the thing just won't render based on how the browser is dealing with this conflict. Like the browser won't handle it, and it's also just against HTML standards to put block elements inside inline elements. But the reverse is very possible. You can put inline elements inside block elements, and you should. In our case, let's look at our layout here. We have this rock guy, and we can maybe copy these two and put them inside of our div. And now we see that this div has these inline elements in it. And that's because the inline elements behave inline according to their like scope of the block parent element. So this inline guy just considers this block to be the document that it exists in, and it'll just like inline within that new like context for itself. It can be inline inside of the block, or it can take up, yeah, like I guess inline inside of the block is where the way I would put it. Whereas if we do the reverse, I think Chrome will handle it. Yeah, Chrome won't like break your thing, but some browsers will, and even more important than that, it's like not against. It's not in keeping with HTML standards of these two things. The other thing with block and inline is they're both CSS properties that we can affect and change. So if I want to make an element that is normally inline, so if I want to change a span, a link, an input, a button to block, I can set it the display property of the inline element to be block. Same with my block level element. If it is a div h1 paragraph, I can choose to make them inline with display block or display inline. If we go into our block example, I'm going to take out that one. I can say this second span, I want to give it a style where I'm saying display block. And when I refresh, our first guy here, he's default and inline style. He doesn't have any block stuff overriding it. Our second one, he is a block element. And then the third one is a inline element. So we don't get that stacking up like we see here, because this guy is demanding his own line, and he's taking up 100% width. He now has, we can actually come in and say width 300 pixels, and he will take up a width of 300 pixels now. So it's a good idea to like remember which ones are block and inline, and if you're ever trying to set the height on something or the width on something and it's not affecting it in any way, a good error checking spot is to see, is it a default inline element? Have I set it to be inline? Try and set the display to block and see if now your height and width are being applied. And then really try not to do this. Any inline elements, don't put block elements inside them. It will, in the very best of cases, kind of render very inconsistently In the worst of cases, it just won't show up, period. Next, we're going to look at another property of elements, I guess like optional property. None of the elements are going to have a default display set to float, but we can use float as another way to align our content. And float, also kind of like the box model, comes from a historical want to create magazine-style web pages. So when the web was first like coming up and content and pages were becoming more common, the natural comparison to web pages and blogs was like newspapers and magazines. So people said, in our websites, let's emulate the similar content in things like magazines and newspapers. So your box model is something that is used in like printing and news as a concept as well. This like margin, border, padding is a layout thing that stretches beyond just HTML. And float is another idea that was like kind of lifted from how do we make something look like a newspaper or magazine. So in this photo we see here, this magazine has a couple like images or like big blocky like logos or graphics, and the text is like wrapping around them. So maybe not the best example, but like these text is wrapping around these images. This text is wrapping around this graphic here. Float was created to kind of get that same aesthetic, that same layout, to be able to insert blocks, figures, or like images and have text flow naturally around the element. These days, we don't see this magazine layout as much, so the use for float is becoming less and less. But we'll look at it, but in your day-to-day uses, when you're trying to get a figure image with this like magazine-style text around, that's when you're going to want it to use float. People hack it to do other things, but that I would discourage that if you can do it another way. Okay, so let's bring up another example. So I have this other HTML layout page. Right now, it doesn't have any floated elements in it. I just have some divs with text in it. We're going to insert floating elements to see how this text interacts with it. So this is our HTML page. It's got some H1s and some an H1 and some divs, and the div just has a nested div with like just words inside. The encasing div has a class of ocean, and the smaller div has a class of ship. This is the CSS that is included. I'm just saying your ocean divs should have this aqua color, and your ship divs should have a light blue color. So we have an ocean div which contains a ship div. So we can see a bit of the ocean showing through, and then this light blue representing the nested one. So this is a ship, and then this bigger ocean div contains the ship. But what we're going to add is we're going to add some new boat divs, and we can give them similarly like a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200. And just like our rock, we're going to give it a background image so we can kind of visualize it better. And I have another image in here, which is just a boat. So we're going to go boat.png. And by default, these bolts are block, but we're going to give it the option to have a left or a right float. And our properties for floating in CSS is we can go float left, or we can go float right. And so inside our HTML, inside the ocean, but above the ship, we can make some divs, and we can assign them a class of boat. And maybe we want all of these boats to float left. So let's make 3 left floating boats. 1, 2, 3. And I'll refresh. Our images aren't showing up, but we have, I think I need to do the same thing we did before, background, size, contain, so that the image is contained within our thing. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we see 3 divs. They're behaving like a block because they're taking up height and width. I gave them a height and width of 200 pixels. And then we told them to float left. So by floating them left, we see each boat is moving up and to the left as much as it can within its given container or div. So these 3 boats are inside of this guy, the ocean, and they're going up and left. But the next thing we see is that even though this ship thing, so this ship thing, we gave it a, where was it? Its block. So it should be starting on like a new line. It is wrapping up around the boats. But that's not quite accurate, actually. The text inside the div is wrapping up around the new boats, but the div itself, we've given it this light blue background color, is still behaving very blocky in that it's taking them as much space as it can, and it's starting on like a new line. It's not continuing on a second line. And the behavior that's happening here isn't that the block is being broken and like allowing other stuff to be around it, but it's that these 3 guys, the floats, are floating on top of the block element. They, don't care about block elements taking up new lines. They will, and in fact, they kind of don't take up space in a similar way that inline elements don't take up space. Block elements don't respect them as actual things taking up space, but inline elements will. So the text inside of our div is inline, so it hits up against one of these floating guys, and it will not overlap them. But the block itself will just take up as much space, thinking that the floats don't even exist. And this is how we get that kind of magazine layout. We can have a figure and then have text wrapping around it, and it's responsive in the sense that as we change this, those boats are going to go just left as much as they can, and any content is going to wrap in the free space available. So that's kind of a weird thing here, right here. But for the most part, it kind of works newspaper-like. Another illustration of this is if we take one of these boats and I put it after the div. It pops down, and it doesn't even extend the content of the div that it's inside. So this blue guy, this ocean one, normally if you put more stuff in a div, it grows to keep it. But floats aren't taking up space in the same way. They kind of float on top of everything. So it's outside of the div completely and has just been floating down here now. So they're not taking up space in the same way that other things do. And the next thing we can look at is that we give all these a left float, but we can also copy them And maybe in this second one, we can change that, like some are going to float left and some are going to float right. And we'll get boats floating left and boats floating right with any inline stuff taking up space in between as it can. So float allows inline items to wrap around them. They do not take up vertical space in a div, but they float on top of block elements and allow inline stuff to wrap around it. You can do it left and right. Again, I would use this style of, like, I would use floats if this is what you want. If you just want something to go left or you just want something to go right, there's better tools than handling this. But if you want that magazine look, that nice 1999 magazine look, you can use floats. An alternative to using this float is maybe inline block. Inline block is a hybrid between block and inlines. So we can go, maybe we'll create a couple more boat classes or boat elements. And instead of having them called left, we'll call them in block. And we'll add a new style specifier, in block, and we'll say display inline dash block. So inline block elements, they're going to behave like block elements in that they take up space. We can give them a width and height, but they behave like inline elements in that they don't create a new line when they're created. And this is like a very good illustration of the difference between like an element that takes up space versus an element that doesn't take up space. So inline block elements take up vertical space. So this real estate from here to here is theirs. They don't let this blue guy, come and interfere with that space because they're taking up vertical space. Whereas up here, our floated elements aren't taking up vertical space. So this blue guy can move to the top of the ocean or this aqua background. It's going to butt right up to the top. Whereas here, we see the difference. Also, if I add another inline block element and I do it after this like ship thing, it's also going to behave more intuitively and take up more space below it. So it's taking up space there, whereas if I turn that same guy into a float, so I say float left, it doesn't take up actual space, so it doesn't extend the div. It's just floating outside after the div has already been closed. The last thing that we'll look at with floats is sometimes we want to put a float in but not have content wrap up around it, or we want it to like start a new line. So in these cases, like maybe we've have some images going, but then we're like, okay, we don't want this right now. We want it to continue starting, say, here. To do this, we have to clear the float. We have to clear the ability of these inline stuff to come and wrap around. And there's also a CSS property for that. So we'll add a new class called clear. And we can say clear, we can say left if we want the left float cleared. We can say right if we want the right float cleared. And we can also say both if we want both. So let's look at kind of each example. We'll go clear left. Our boat. We'll make our, add a new div here. And we'll give this class clear. So we're saying throw the boats in, and then this element is telling all of the float to clear. And if we refresh, we see the float being cleared so that the elements are now taking up a new line and not wrapping around the floats. I think if we shrink it, we can get here. So our left floats are cleared, but this one, which is a right float, will still float on top of this block. You know, no matter what we do, these top left ones will not float on top of the block. And then alternatively, we could go clear both. And that we wouldn't be able to get that behavior. So it clears both of the floats in this case. How are floats? Anything we should go over? Any questions on floats? With a lot of this like CSS stuff, you're just gonna have to experiment with it too, and you'll get the hang of it. One tool or like suggestion is use this developer tools to try styles before you go and add it to a style sheet. So you've seen a couple times I've clicked on something. So if I'm here and I say, okay, what if this header maybe had a different color? I can go in here and say I want the color to be like red, and I can test that and be like, oh, okay, I kind of like that. Most of the time, it's more for like, I want the margin bottom. I'm not sure the value, so I can quickly try a bunch. I can say, what if it's like 30 pixels on the bottom? Oh, that's too little. What if I do like 100 pixels? You can do a bunch of quick changes really fast without having to like swap back over to your editor, make the change, save, refresh the page. Do all of your experimenting here, and then once you find something that looks nice, take it over and add it to your style sheet. So yeah, that inline block, last one we saw, behaves inline, but you can set width and height. We'll look at selectors, but before we do that, this is kind of a note on, it says looking to the future/present. These are tools that most front-end developers are going to be using nowadays. The first one, Flexbox. This is a built-in to CSS tool. It's not something external like Bootstrap that you guys have seen. Flexbox aims to correct some of the frustrating parts of the box model by rewriting how we lay out the page. It's not yet universally adopted. It pretty much is. Like, this is a site that shows, the adoption rate of like certain tech. So we can see that it has a 95.7% fully adoption and a 98.68% some features adoption. You can use it across any browsers. You can see if you're using a really old version of Opera or Opera Mobile, you might kind of get screwed. Or if you're using really old Internet Explorer. Those are cases that you're probably not going to be designing for. So look into Flexbox. You will see it in a later lecture as well. But I'm just bringing these up because if the box model and like floats seem a little like finicky, it's because they kind of are, and there's these new tools that were created to address those issues. So Flexbox is one of them. The other one is CSS Grid. It's even newer than Flexbox, so it has a bit less adoption rate than Flexbox, but it's like changing day by day. Like that number is going up. Even Flex or CSS Grid has a higher adoption rate. So it's for laying out things. And then lastly, I don't have it here, but last week you were using Bootstrap for some of your stuff, for some of your styling, and that's a CSS framework. So those are other tools that you can use for styling your things. I think Bootstrap can be good, but you should use it with an understanding of what it's doing. So if you can understand the CSS behind it and kind of get an intuition on how it's applying and making things look different, as opposed to just thinking, if I add this CSS like class, it just magically makes stuff look in a certain way, then I would encourage you not to use Bootstrap and try and kind of dive into the understanding behind it. Yeah. So originally this lecture was broken into 2 parts, and we're not supposed to go too in depth onto specificity, but I think we have a little bit of time that we can look into it. Because it is, I mean, it was a lot of the questions that we were getting, and it's something that we can look at kind of quick. So our selectors, these are the way that we're selectively choosing to apply style to elements in our document. So if I go div, comma, dot primary, I'm saying apply any style that's in between these brackets to all things or all attributes that are divs and all things that have the class dot primary. I can also do a style like this where I'm saying div, no comma, dot primary, and this is a selector where I'm saying grab divs that also have the primary class. So this is like an and, div and primary. This is like an or, elements with div or elements with primary. And then this last one is a hierarchy selector. So I'm saying to divs, actually no, I'm saying to classes that have primary, or elements that have the class primary that are inside of divs. We're going to brush through these things because, again, it's not the focus, but I think it's good to cover. Specificity is the way that we're deciding which style is winning out and being applied to our elements. So we had that waterfall thing, and we saw that like different colors of text were being applied depending, I don't know, I must have changed we had different text being applied, and the question was like, why is one red, why is one white, why is one blue? Is this based on whether that style element, so something like this, was included first, middle, or later? And the answer is most of the times no. The battle of whether one style gets applied over another is based on its specificity. So the specificity is created from a number, and the higher the number, the higher the number of 2 styles, the higher one will be applied, or the higher one will win. So when you're looking at 2 styles, you need to think of the one with the higher priority, and you can build the number based on this little image here. So you check if it's an inline style, and you give it a 0 or a 1 here. If it is inline, you give it a 1. You check how many IDs it's selecting for. You put the number of IDs that it's selecting for here. You check how many classes it's selecting for here, and then you check how many elements and pseudo elements it's selecting for here. So I think it's best to like check with an example. So here we have 2 classes, a red class and a blue one. And the question is, will this text be red or blue? And in this case, it will be red because our selector value will be 1, 0, 0, so it'll be like 100. And the second one has 1 element. Sorry. The second one has 1 element and then 2 classes. So we have 2 and 1. Its selector number will be 21, or like 2 and 1. So if you have an ID, you're more powerful than if you had like 100 attributes and pseudo classes and elements. IDs trump classes, classes trump element selectors, and inline styles trump all of them. In the case where you have a tie, where both things have an ID, then you go to classes and you see who has greater classes. If both classes are the same, then you go to elements and you see who has the greater number of element selectors. I'll give you access to both of these notes so you can look into them. Read through on selectors to get a better idea. I know we haven't gone over IDs and classes, and those are kind of important to this idea of specificity, but it's a bit out of the scope of this lecture. But I'll give you both of these to read up on, and I just didn't want to end without looking at kind of why one style would get chosen over another style. And the reason why one style would get chosen over another style is because of this number that you'd build up here. Some styles are more powerful because they're more specific. A less specific style is less powerful, less chance to be applied to your thing. So when you were using Bootstrap, if it has a specific style of a button and you're trying to and you just go dot button and then you tell its color to be red and nothing happens, that's because the selector that they were using was probably you're trying to go dot button and give it a color of red. And you're like, why isn't this applying? It's because in Bootstrap, they have something that's probably like div dot button dot import. No, what was it? You can have button BTN, BTN. Oh yeah, primary. That's giving you the color. So if you have these two things, I'm like, why isn't it going red? I think the primary is usually a gray or black or black or something. It's because the Bootstrap one was more specific. It had more selectors or better selectors. So this will always win out over a simple one like this because it's more specific. Yeah, that's everything we were going to cover. I hope this last tangent into specificity I hope it was helpful as opposed to confusing. I know we didn't go into depth into it, but I'll give you the notes. And I just didn't want to leave it untouched. I'll be around. Let me know if you have any questions about specificity in particular because I covered it so briefly, but anything else as well. Thanks.